the 17th dinner, plus or minus 2, since Bob Pransky wasn't sure exactly how 15 and 19 he thought was correct. Annual dinner of the Philadelphia Mikveh Association Western Branch. We'd like to keep the program compact, and so I'd like to welcome the Rabbanim and the Rosh Yeshivas who are with us here this evening, and to ask the Moed Asra, Rabbi Abraham Levine, to extend greetings on behalf of the congregation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Goldman. Whenever I start speaking, funny things happen. Either in the kehillah or in the microphone, one or the other. Thank you. It's a great pleasure and joy for me, as always, to stand here before you at this very auspicious and important, elevating occasion. The Mikveh Dinner is one of the most beautiful and wonderful and purifying events of our yearly Jewish calendar in the shul and in the community at large. I feel especially dinner because I think back to the times when just a few of us stood together, tried to envision having a mikvah in this neighborhood. It seems like such a far out dream. Baruch Hashem, the Almighty helps us. The joy of seeing the mikvah continue to grow, number of users grow, the support for the mikvah grow, and the people who understand more and more the need for education of mikvahs, the people who are oisik and involved in this education. There's so many wonderful shiurim going on. The meaning of what a mikveh really holds for each and every one of us, for Taras Bas Yisrael. Jewish child that is born, who deserves that kedusha that we have. Once observed that the entire physical structure of a mikveh has within it great meaning and import. The mikveh, we know that we are not allowed to take mayim she'uvim. Basically, we use the water that is constantly recycled, comes from the ground and goes up to the atmosphere and returns to the ground purified. Everything in life goes through the various cycles of nature and goes back some stage or the other to the place from whence it was birthed, to the clouds, to the heavens, comes back to the earth. Years ago, it's one of the Mikveh Dinner. In all of its glory, the sun itself goes through this procedure each and every day. We see it set, go down into the ocean, comes back the next day purified. Even the sun that shines down upon the earth goes through this ritual of purification, this holy ritual, purifying itself and coming back cleansed, what the sun looks at during its course of the day. And how can the sun come back and look upon a world filled with all the terrible and frightening things that one sees? Back, renewed, strengthened, because it has gone down into that great ocean that is far up on the horizon, returns to us again purified. And all of this water that we speak of, all this great power of purification, this life-giving fluid that comes down and goes back, cleansed and purified, the same process works for us as well with the mikveh in terms of kedusha. Here we have all of these waters gathered together in a small space. The amount of water in a mikveh gathered in a small space surrounded by walls teaches us also a phenomenon. This is not done b'sham askar, it's done privately. Within the 4 amos of privacy, modesty, and within the 4 amos the Almighty only adds in this world is the Dalad Amishal Lokah Bavad, and we today go further to these Dalad Amos of the mikveh, and from thence to let the Kedusha, not the immodesty, and not the showmanship, and not the whole tararam, as we say, of the world, but rather the Kedusha and the modesty naturally and beautifully, and filter through into the hearts and the neshamas of all Israel. On behalf of our shul, I would like to welcome each and every one of the supporters of the mikveh to our shul, one of the places where actually this mikveh started, and to welcome each and every one of the people who have so ardently worked for the mikveh, who support it, who love it, who utilize it, and who try and make it available to everyone. At the same time, it's a great joy and honor to me to welcome each and every one of our most important guests that we have here today, all of whom play a part and are playing a part in the mikveh. The president of the association, our esteemed friend Mr. Pransky, we always enjoy and watch for his slavas and his tznius, his modesty and his niceness and refinement, and our esteemed chairman, one who I have listened to as he finished the sentence of Gemara and Nedid and Shas, and also does this with a tznius and a modesty and a refinement, to my dear colleagues, Rav Mandelbaum, who is always the first in every Dover Shebikdusha, Kaplan, who stands in the forefront of anything, any spearhead that is to be thrust forward in Yiddishkeit and in the elevation of our Tehillah, of Iceland, who put out a lovely sefer. Actually, I would call it a sefer because it's something that each and every one of us can use. Go over the halachas and to read it and to look through it and to see how he did it is a testimony to the Kedusha and Torah that he put into it, B'shas Maisis, a great testimony to him. And it is something that is improving each and every one of us. And I would like to welcome, I don't want to take anything away from you, Dr. Goldman, I can't. I don't need any words that I can say to take away from your beautiful way of expressing yourself. But in my modest way, I would like to welcome Fulda, whom we have heard so much, and who I'm sure will raise us, elevate us with his words of beauty and Kedusha and power. Thank you all. Welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi Levine. I will not attempt, especially after that, to say anything either graceful or beautiful. I do want to indicate, however, that I am particularly delighted to introduce Rabbi Dr. Meir Fulda for 2 reasons. Because
Rabbonim, Rabbi Mendelbaum, Rabbi Rabosa. In addressing an annual get-together, the question inevitably arises, what topic should one choose to communicate? The letter that Bob sent me specifically stated, it doesn't have to be about. True, it has to be one of the areas in which I specialize. I guess it goes back to the time that I learned Midden Mikveh with my Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik, 3 years consecutively. Because he claimed he didn't know it, he kept reviewing it. The old lady don't see the south of the hose. You see, oh, good. I have been giving shiurim and lectures in Taras Mishpacha over the course of many decades. But then I heard that many of your previous speakers in previous years have addressed that particular topic in different venues. Then it was time perhaps to speak of a different topic. So what Nancy, who is a very dear Talmid of mine, Nancy Goodman, along with many others who I want to take her out, I'm thinking her out only because she don't make the arrangements. I said no 2 years ago, and last year, so finally this year I had to say yes. I decided to share with you an evening of reflecting and recollecting the Churban that was wreaked upon us by the Nazis, Yemach Shemon Zifron, of which I'm a survivor, because in the month of Iyar, we don't have a problem that we normally do with regard to Yom HaShoah. Mr. Bura says that the month of Nisan, I don't really need a mic. Can you hear me without the mic? No? Okay. The month of Nisan, better? The month of Nisan is a real problem with Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura. Because the month of Nisan is Kuloi Kodesh. Even the Kel Mole is a problem. True, Rabbi Chaim Golim makes a distinction between a Hesped and Bechiyah, which one is allowed, which one is not allowed. Even Gura, we claim the Cho Hashem Agdula v'Hagvura. Even the word Shoah I don't like, because Tanakh Shoah is really used for a catastrophe that's by nature, but not for human beings at a hand. And the Holocaust is altogether a horrible term. The Greek translation of Korban. But Rebbeinu B'Kuli Alma, sometimes we ought to recollect and reflect at what happened here. From a theological point of view. And I thought perhaps in Iyar, in the Yemei HaSfira, when there is Miktzas Avelis, we can take a little bit of an evening aside and think about it. I'll start off by saying that I think that perhaps I am a living demonstration of the truth of the statement of the founder of Chassidus, the best. The Baal Shem Tov Zatzal once said that when a Yid undergoes a tremendous tragedy, inevitably, says the best, you go through 3 stages. The first stage, he says, is the stage of Bechiyah, where you cry and you weep. And the second stage is a stage of Dumiyah, Domim, when you're absolutely silent like a rock. And finally, says the best, there comes a third stage of Shira, where you find words to speak again and even to sing again. My Rabbi Sai, This was surely true in my case. When we first came to America, I must tell you that for the first few years I found myself often crying. Sometimes for no apparent reason. I had a lot to cry about. In one branch of my mishpacha alone in the city of Aurich, northern Germany, 70 of 71 were killed and only one little girl survived, was now living in Los Alamitos, California. Or our economic matzah, for the first 2.5 years after coming here, I had no bed to sleep on, we were too poor. We mixed the milk with water because we couldn't afford the milk. The subway in New York at that time was only a nickel, but we didn't have the nickel. So I walked. So there was what to cry about, of course. All kinds of crying. But then came another stage. And Hal called me here, he was in my chair. And Reese is here. Dr. Goldman's wife mentioned some of those that occurred to me at the moment. And for decades, I was in the stage of dumiyah, of absolute rock-like silence. My Talmidim and Talmidah just never heard me speak at all about my so-called Holocaust experience. Am I right? In fact, some probably didn't even know I went through it. I don't know why, I just could not get myself to speak about it. The best was right. The tongue didn't want to talk. The heart didn't let, for whatever reason. But ultimately, there came a third stage. And as I said, that's the stage where we find words to speak again, and even the courage to sing again, Shira. What caused the change in the last few years? Not so long ago. But it's hard to pinpoint. Perhaps it is because as one gets older, one becomes more aware of the fragility of life. I was stricken with a major heart attack some years ago. It was critical for 10 days. Chazde Hashem, I survived, and then sometime later I was stricken with spinal meningitis, and again I was critical, and Baruch Hashem, I survived. But it does bring home one thing to you. The fragility, the impermanence of life in Olam Hazeh. And one begins to think, if not now, if not now, when? Perhaps it is when you hear black politicians like Jesse Jackson and others saying that they're tired of hearing of the Holocaust. Perhaps it is when historians want to prove to us that it's all an exaggeration and didn't really happen, the revisionists. Whatever the reason. The emotions become so strong that one even gets garbled, even as I garble now, when one thinks of the horror of this. So one speaks out. But before we speak out, my Rabbi say, and that's really what I want to get across here. We, Torah Yidden, must approach it with a certain hashkafa. May I quote to you a halacha in Shulchan Aruch? Yerideyes Siman Shinayim Vov. In Seif Beis, the Ramah tells us that when we go to be Menachem Avot, someone is sitting Shiva, someone has suffered a grievous loss. The one who's Menachem Avot can never say to the one sitting Shiva, but what could you have done? Because after all it was impossible to change it. Listen to the Ramah, based in Gemara Bava Kama. That is almost heresy. That is almost blasphemy. You know why? Because it implies that if we could change it, we would change it, and that is kfirah, because that means HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not perfect, and we believe Hatur Tovim Polo, and Tzaddik Hashem B'chol Tochav V'Toy B'chol Nasa. So whether we understand it or not, our emunah should never be infringed upon. Of course it's beyond our comprehension. The horror is much too great even to think we can understand it. let us never, chas v'sholom, get involved in something which is kechiru begiru. Let's remember the Gemara in the Chulim, Daf Zayin Amud Beis. Ein Odom doikev etzboi milamata, elam kein machrizin olov milamalo. I can't even nick or cut my little finger down here unless it's decreed up there. I'll ask us, kama v'chama. Such a momentous occurrence and the Khurban that we witnessed. And the Gemara is very interesting. I'm amazed in the Persians don't comment on it. I'm really amazed. On that Mimba Rabbi Chanina, the Gemara quotes Sheneva, Psukim. And the Gemara first quotes a Pasuk in Tehillim, and then a Pasuk in Mishlei. Mind you, both Psukim begin with the same words. Me Hashem mitzadei geva. That all the steps of the human being come from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the Gemara didn't stop with the Pasuk in Tehillim, and make sure to go on and quote the Pasuk in Mishlei, which starts the same way but ends, the Adam Nayodin Darkoi. Who is the human being who is limited and finite that he should be able to understand the derech of Hashem? It's beyond us. That's where really Munah leads. Now, Rabbi Sai, we have a whole sefer of Eov. And when Eov asked the questions, why? Do you know how he ultimately retained his emunah? Not because he got the answer, because he was taught that as long as we're human, the full answer cannot be given to us and is not comprehensible. That permits us to retain our emunah. That permits us to at least be as much ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim as those who went to their death al kiddush Hashem singing on Imam in Emunah Shlema. And that should permit us again to find words for the Shira, which is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants of us. Why did it happen? A few reflections before I recollect. Why did it happen? Meir Rabbi Sai, I think it's very fascinating that the answer I want to give you is in the name of someone who saved thousands of Jews from assimilation and reform, ducked in the country which became then the source of the Holocaust. He noticed something that, to the best of my knowledge, no other Mefarish noticed. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told us in the Chumash why he chose Avraham Avinu to be the first Yid. And the Pasuk reads, Ki yadati, I knew about him, Lemana sheyitzaveh ve'iseh ve'izbonav Yaakov, that he would command his family, his children after him, Ve'shomu derech Hashem, la'asoi tzedakah u'mishpat. They will observe the way of Hashem to do tzedakah and mishpat. I wish you would get a chance to look at his perush on the Chumash there. He sounds almost like a prophet. It's almost eerie how this Godel the Yisrael was living in Germany way before, almost prophesied what would happen in a place like Germany, which supposedly had the highest culture. He said, mind you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't say that he's going to influence his children and family to observe the way of Hashem and to do tzedakah or mishpat, like two different things. No. Shomu derech Hashem, there's no more. La says tzedakah or mishpat, which means there is no guarantee for tzedakah and mishpat unless it's the derech Hashem. And anybody who will ever tell you that culture and education and knowledge and progress and whatever can guarantee menschlichkeit, it's a lie. It's only the derech Hashem that can lead to tzedakah and mishpat, and we saw it in our time. Incidentally, again, you could look at his perush. That's how we also can explain when Avraham Avinu answered Avimelech, when he said that Sarah is his sister and not his wife, and he said, yes, I know everything you're telling me. You say you have laws against adultery and laws against this, but it's not worth anything, because only one thing is missing, It's not grounded in Yiras Hashem. And if it's not grounded in Yiras Hashem, then there is no stability, there is no guarantee that it's going to be upheld. The question is, what can we learn from these horrible happenings? And Meir Fulda, there are two things that we must learn. It's two sides of one coin. One is obvious, and in Torah circles, it's always stressed. But the problem is we're preaching to the converted. And that is the first lesson, that no matter how much a Yid tries to assimilate and become like the Goy, it's not going to help. A Yid remains a Yid remains a Yid because Hitler and Hashemayim made no difference. All the Yidden were persecuted. All of them were tortured. All of them were killed. Including all those who thought they could beat it by assimilating or decimating the faith of their forefathers. But Meir Fulda, as much as it hurts, let's admit it, that's only one side of the coin. There is another side of the coin which we must learn also. And what's that? And that is that as long as there is one Yid out there who is not yet thrown, it's your job and my job to turn him or her on with love and compassion and outreach to make them from. And if we don't, we are guilty. Let's never forget that. There is no such thing as saying there's an assimilated American Jew out there who's not from, and I'm happy that I'm from. If he's walking out there and he's not turned on, then we are doing something wrong by not reaching out. And we can't only do it by fire and brimstone. We must do it gently. And sometimes we must do it with a lot of the Rebbe says, the Siras Nefesh, sacrificing part of our Nefesh to bring back. Can it be done? Of course it can be done. I'd like to share with you two stories which I've never forgotten. It was 8 years ago. Tafshin Mem Aleph. My wife, my daughter, and I were in Eretz Yisrael. The first story I'll tell you, it just happened. Sunday was Tisha B'Av. It was the Monday after Tisha B'Av. I was on a bus going to Petah Tikva, to the kever of my father's Atal. There was one seat empty next to me, and a swarthy Chayal, a soldier, gets on the bus. He didn't want to sit next to me. Probably I looked too much like hat, like kapota. Didn't want. I said to him, Vakasha Lashem Akadoni. Finally he sat down, there was no other seat. I engaged him in conversation. It turns out he's a Beit Mani. He's one of 10 children. I asked him whether his father is religious. And he said, yes. That's up. And then he added to me mockingly, Avalani, Piloni Legamri. I'm told to be religious. And sort of to mock me, he said to me, it's more Hayabish Shvi'i to Yom Gagil, Achalti B'Shatiti. Yesterday, Tisha B'Av. It was like a regular day for me. I ate and I drank. I didn't react. I continued the conversation. I asked him what he does. He told me he's near the border in Lebanon. I asked him whether it's dangerous. He said yes. I asked him whether some of his Chaverim have lost their life. He said yes, 2 of them did. And they were wounded. He said even he was once wounded already. But it was, Baruch Hashem, only light one. And then I said very, very softly to him, in Hebrew, I said to him, you know, my good friend, I'm not so sure that you're right. You said before that I'm the Dati, religious, and you're the Chiloni. I don't know. And I gave him a Rambam, because the Rambam says Nilchus Tshuva, and he listened. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu weighs the Amitzvahs and Avelis, he doesn't weigh it according to the number. but he weighs it according to the quality rather than the quantity. And the Rambam paskins that one mitzvah can outweigh 1,000 aveiros. And sometimes the reverse, and the Rambam ends that only a Kodesh Baruch Hu knows. I said, you know, how do you know? Maybe the fact that you are willing to put your life in danger to protect your brothers and sisters, maybe that outweighs all the mitzvahs that I have. How do I know? As far as I'm concerned, it could very well be that when the Eibishter makes the cheshbon, that you'll come out way ahead. I don't know. I don't see how you could know. When he left the bus, he said to me in Hebrew, no Dati ever spoke to me like you did. And he said to me, I want you to know, the next opportunity, for the first time in years, I'm going to go back to a shul and die. And like a typical Sfaradi, I was stunned. He kissed my hand, which is a Sfaradi custom. In other words, one good thought, and just telling a little bit of the truth, could turn somebody around. One thing understood. What we all can do. I was on the number 1 bus, the same year. I couldn't work, you let it come to me. Wasn't even planned. And we were going to the hotel. I was sitting on that number 1 bus. There was one empty seat next to me. Opposite me was a Hasidic type man sitting with an empty seat next to him. Across was another Hasidic type sitting with one empty seat. My wife and daughter were sitting behind me. The Hasidic appearing Yidden, but probably 20 years older than I was at least, talking Yiddish. Bus stops, 2 women get on the bus. 2 women. It's clear they were not too high enough, whatever. And they came to our part of the bus looking to sit 2 seats. There were no 2 seats. Now, I don't even think they understood the conversation because I spoke Yiddish. So I turned to the older Yid opposite me, and I said to him, maybe we can make room. And that came a taunting answer to me. The Yiddish is still ringing in my ears. Ihr deiket wegen sei. You're worried about them as if they're from mine. I waited about 5-10 seconds, and I said, name the Yid. Ich deiket wegen uns. I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about us. Instantaneously, he moved to the other side next to the other Yid. The 2 women sat down. Listen to this. I think it was the whole conversation was lost on them because everybody didn't know Yiddish. When I got off the bus, that Yid who had taunted me was at least 20 years older than I was. Hugged me and kissed me, called me Rebbe, and said to me in Yiddish, I'll give you his Yiddish. Rebbe, I stehe. Ihr habt mir keinen Gewinn an Mitzvah von Hashavas Avede, ihr betrieben Ahavas Yisrael. He said, you taught me something, you gave me back something I've lost Ahavas Yisrael. I cried more than he did. And I said, don't you realize that only with the way that we did it do we have a hope of getting them back to us? And that the other way we'll just be sure to lose them? And he cried some more and he says, gerecht sind wir. That's the other side of the coin. And you know what it's based on? I asked Rabbi Eisenman to give me the Gemara in Brochus. There's a famous Tosfos in Brochus. Shloisha sheyochlu. I want you to know what Tosfos says. There's a principle. Even though I fulfilled my obligation already, I can still make a bracha to be most to you with the exception of Lechem and Yain, and that would hold true even for Birkas HaMazon. Why? Because of Kol Yisrael Arevin Zeh. As long as there is one Jew who hasn't yet done it, it's my responsibility. And anyone who smugs and says, I'm doing okay, he's not doing okay. That's the other side. Where I Rabbi side with these reflections of the Havdalah, I want to share with you a few recollections from some things we can also learn. First of all, you should know one thing. Reality and appearances are not always the same. You would think that with a name like I have Fulda, which is the name of a city in Germany, and here yet I come from Fulda, and if you would know that my legal name is not even Meir but Manfred, you'd be almost certain that Manfred Fulda from Fulda has to be a Yeti from way back. Let me tell you, you're wrong on every count. Let me tell you, it's one thing I want, because we think in stereotypes. Who was the founder of my family? A very famous Gadol of Yisrael, Rabbi from Vizhnitz, who was called to be the Rav in Fulda in the 17th century. He came to Rosh Yeshiva there. In those days, they had no last name. So he was called Rabbi Fulda. He's printed in every Yerushalmi, Rav Fulda. From my mother's side, I come straight from the Bach. I come from Saloniki. It so happens that later on, that they met in that particular city. As far as the first name is concerned, let me tell you a story. My parents had several children. When my older sisters were born, anti-Semitism was at a rather low ebb. They got no secular names. Gittel was Gittel, and Rus was Rus. By the time my brother already was born, anti-Semitism was so bad that then the Yidden were looking to give the most Teutonic names possible, that you shouldn't immediately become a carbon of anti-Semitism. And so, let me tell you a little bit, by the way, about that city. Fulda was one of the very few, only three like that in all Germany, where there was no reform ever. There was no reform. Maybe it was the Sluss of the Manamshik, who was the road there, who was Medrash, still had the Sluss to Daven, and the misfortune to see them burn it, Stalnach. All the stores were Shema Shabbos, and the only two that were not, amazing, you hear? Opened the doors on Shabbos for the goyim to come in, only on the side, not the front, because that they wouldn't do. They didn't have the chutzpah to openly say, we're B'chalei Shabbos. The Yidden had a Chevra Shas, and my father, like many others, learned every day for a minimum of an hour and a half before they went to work. All that, of course, was wiped out. Juden rein. Hitler Yerach Shemayim was a very godly wish. It was an interesting thing how Yiddishkeit took hold there, by the way. In the year 1235, that city was the first city in Jewish history where the infamous Alilas Dam was made. They accused the Jews of having killed a little Goyish baby and using the blood to make matzahs. And in typical Germanic fashion, they slaughtered and massacred 32 Jews. Then they imposed a tremendous fine on the Jewish community. Then they appointed a commission to find out whether it's really true. Typical. When the commission report came back that it's not true, then the Kaiser Friedrich gave a special edict promising the Jews his protection, that the charges could never again be made, and probably that's why Fulda then became a Mokum Torah, because they had a certain amount of protection where people could live a Yiddish life. I remember when I was a kid, barely 5 years old, Hitler came to power in 1933. Let me share something else with you, which again will smash a stereotype. I was a little kid, but you know what I remember? I remember the Nazis marching around town with a torchlight parade for Fakultu, and they were singing those accursed words, Heute Deutschland, morgen die ganze Welt, Deutschland über alles. Today Germany, tomorrow the whole world. Germany over everything. And my father dinning into us, Germany is no place for Jews. We're going to leave, and we're going to leave tonight, and we'll leave behind business, the house, everything, just to get out. And that night, we took the train to Kiel, which was the city across the border from France. This I don't remember. This I'm just telling you now because I was told it. And we crossed on foot to Strasbourg. And the gendarmes, the border police of the great French democracy, caught us since we had no visa, arrested us, and would you believe it, they deported us back into Nazi Germany. So that we were worse off than had we not tried to flee, because we had given the ultimate insult to the regime by saying money doesn't count, business doesn't count, and house doesn't count. Just gig shouldn't be there. Let me tell you another something. It was November 1938, just about 50 years ago, the infamous Kristallnacht. The little commentaries. My father and mother had gone to the city of Stuttgart to try and get a visa for the family. We 4 kids were home alone. 2 sisters, a brother, and I. They were on the way back from Stuttgart unsuccessful, and were overnight at a Jewish hotel in Frankfurt am Main. And my older sister gets a call from my uncle, Oliver Shalom, that the Nazis are moving around town. The Nazis are moving around town. They're pillaging, they're plundering, and in some cases, not only beating up, they even kill them. He begged us, my older sister, pull down the shutters, put out the lights, bar the doors, and give the house an abandoned look. Maybe they'll think no one's home. Sometime later, we heard the Nazi mob from behind boarded shutters coming, and they were in the house next door. Funny what one remembers, you know what I remember? I was 9 years old at the time. For some reason, don't ask me why, I ran to the 3rd floor of the building, and where a dentist had an office, and I tried to hide in the dentist chair, and I said Shema Yisrael 100 times a minute. Now, why I said Shema Yisrael, then I know. But why I should have run to a dentist chair, don't ask me. My sister found me and said, what are you doing up there? Either we're together or we're going to be gone separately. Besides, we have work to do. I said, what work? We have to stay. We have to hide the Sefer Torah. My father, Zatzal, had bought the Sefer Torah. All his life, by the way, he had wanted a Sefer Torah. It's a special Sefer Torah, by the way. I'll tell you that story right now. And there was an ad in the German Jewish weekly that the Sefer Torah was for sale in the city of Hanau. And he told my mother, if I could possibly get that Sefer Torah, I'm going to go get it. We went to the city of Hanau, and he heard the Robert passed away, and the Almona, the widow, was trying to raise money and sell him the Sefer Torah. So we went to her house. She made a price. He said he wants to think about it. He went to Mincha Meirish, and he asked the Shamas, what is the economic situation of that widow, the Rebbe? It's terrible. Finnish Kinderlach, no life insurance. And it seems the Shamas found out from the Rebbe later on, because my father didn't tell the story. And he went back to the Rebbe. He said, I thought about it, and she told him. So did I, you can have it for 50% less. And instead what he answered is, Rebbe, you're making a mistake. I found out by accident that this Sefer was written by a very, very rare scribe, and is worth 3 times the amount that you asked for it, and he gave her a check for 3 times. That was that Sefer Torah. That's the Sefer Torah which we hid in the attic with rags that the Nazis shouldn't find it. That Sefer Torah, by the way, survived and is now in the room of my 95-year-old mother, B'liyayin Harach, from which I laid her Kasha Zohar. Still with us. That's because she has. She, by the way, Baruch Hashem, a great-great-grandmother. And that little boy's father is learning on Lakewood. And that new little boy born less than a year ago was named after my father, Zatzal. So Hitler really didn't succeed. Because Netzach Yisrael, Lo Yishach. We do have a future. At any rate, just as we're about to see what's happening, the Nazis are the house next door. You should know we hear the screams. Luckily, the family Stern wasn't home. And we figured we're next. We're throwing on furniture down the window. Suddenly, we hear the key turning in the door. And who was it? It was the 17-year-old Catholic son of the family that lived on the 2nd floor of the apartment building where we lived. Exceptional people. Really, Yekida is Gula, Hasidah Masa'elam, the exception to the room. He comes in, he sees us crying, typical German fashion. He says to us, don't worry. He speaks of himself in 3rd person. Felix is here. Only German can do that. Felix is here. And then he adds one thing. He says, Ich bin nicht wie all die anderen. I'm not like all the rest. That 17-year-old kid said, incidentally, when I was interviewed for the public broadcast on this, and I told this story, they deliberately left out that line of the kid. I'm not like all the rest, because they were afraid that if that line would be there, the Goyim would be offended. And it was typical commentary of what goes on. I'm only sorry he had signed my release before. At any rate, what he did was he ran upstairs. We didn't know what he was going to do. He thought maybe it's bravado. And 2 minutes later, he calls down to us, come on up and watch me. We ran upstairs. And there he was in his full Hitler Youth uniform. Amazing, with the swastika, the whole thing. Looking out the window, cool like a cucumber. The mob is there, they were saying, you won't give it up, the Zau you, the Louis Fulda, whatever they said. And he said, oh no, he's screaming. We got rid of those swine Jews a long time ago. Are you kidding? There's not one Jew left here. The house has been sold to Aryans. Any damage you will do, you will have to pay for. And they swallowed it. Until the ringleader noticed the mezuzah. And a young man said, dust. And that kid thought again fast. And he said, oh, we were saving that for a special ceremony to make a bonfire. And the ringleader shot back, that's wonderful, that's the our pleasure. And they ripped out the mezuzah. Yodel, Judah, Rector. Whatever. I want to tell you something. That 17-year-old Catholic boy was unusual. Yes. His parents were such Hasidim. His father and mother continued to feed my grandparents until they were deported to Theresienstadt at risk to their own life in the middle of the night. Later on, the father of that boy was sent to Buchenwald along with all the other Jews where my father was also. You should know that. It's unbelievable. When we left Germany, they hid us in a basement. I still remember his parting speech. And he said to us that if there is a God in heaven, that's how the boy spoke, then Germany will have to burn for what it's doing to the Jew, because God can't tolerate that. And the worst thing is, he says, that my people also tolerate it. That will burn them up. That the so-called Catholic Church that was preaching love and this and that and the other thing, he said it's all a fake. What I want to share with you is one thing. Don't let anyone tell you differently. In my time, there was about 30,000 goyim in that town, yes? 10% of 30,000 is how much? 3,000, yes? 1% is 300, right? Right? 1/10 of 1% is 30. There weren't 30 good goyim in the whole town. Right, Minyan or Binyan actively and passively enjoyed the slaughter and the persecution and the torture of the Yidden. Almost no Hasidei Umosoila. Let no one falsify and rewrite history. Yes, there are exceptions. Far and in between. My father got out, by the way, slept off the Buchenwald. When he finally, with Nissim and the Floyds, was released, Nissim and the Floyds, I want you to know he was beyond recognition. Most embarrassing moment in my life. I asked my mother, who's that man? My mother said, don't you recognize your father? He was beyond recognition. Lost 80 pounds, the eyes, no eyes, the face was no face. It was nothing, nothing. And so it went. And I tell you, by the way, after the war, we did receive a call. Guess from whom? That Catholic boy's sister Hildegard. She became a GI war bride. And she had received a charge from her parents. You get to America, track down the Fuldas. And if you find them, remember they have no graves to go to, because they don't know where their family was killed and where they're buried. At least they're entitled to the dishes with which we fed their grandparents. Let them have the dishes instead of graves. And she brought those dishes to us. Unbelievable. But I want you to know, there was almost nobody like them. That's the difference. What I want you to learn from all this is, and that's the bottom line, we have to lead a certain kind of life, of emunah, and bitachon, and do what's right regardless. And I'll close with one story about my father, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, which is a story that I did not find out until he was no longer living. I was sitting Shiva. It was the 5th day of Shiva, I remember it vividly, when an old, frail man, bent over, at that time in the 70s, came into the Shiva house with a stick cane, kam as a Christachos, sits opposite me. Said to me with a heavy German accent. Rabbi Fulda, you don't know me, but I wanted to come to you to tell you what kind of a father you had. He was a great man, something like that. And I remember the anger welling up within me. I guess I shouldn't have been angry, but I remember how I reacted. I felt, who is there a stranger to tell me about my father? I lived with him. And I remember telling him, he said, look, don't tell me about my father. My father was well off on the other side, but he didn't have a car, and my mother didn't have a fur coat, they didn't own a house, and they didn't go on vacation. What did he spend the money on? I'll tell you what. He imported a tremendous Tabachota from Poland who had 7 children, and he supported all 9 people just to teach us Torah. That's what he spent his money on. So don't tell me about my father. Before every young we would go to the little villages and leave not to the safe for all the Yanir. Finally, the man says to me, very persistent, Rabbi Fulda, what I want to tell you, you couldn't know. So please listen. Tells me the following story. It was November 10th, 1938. The day after Kristallnacht. My father was in that Jewish hotel. He was on his way to go to Minion. And as he left the hotel room, along with thousands of other Jews, he was arrested. Taken to the big hall in front of Damayim until they got ready to ship him off to the concentration camp of Buchenwald. This frail old man lived in Frankfurt Damayim. When the camp cars were ready, and the Nazis, the SS people came with the whips to brutally and viciously whip them onto the camp cars, this man says, I began to scream, to cry, sob, wail, whatever. He says, no one paid attention, except one person. Turned out to be your father, who didn't know me at all. I didn't know him, he didn't know me. He said to me, why are you crying? And I answered him, look at me, I'm nothing but skin and bones. You know that I'm not going to survive once that whip cracks me. One crack of the whip and I'm finished. There's no way I'm going to survive. Your father answered me, please don't cry. I think I understand now why Hashem Yisbarach made me taller than you. What's the problem? When it's going to be our turn to be loaded through the cattle car, stay close to me and crouch under me, and I'll bend over you. The whip will go on my back and not on yours. And he said to me, the kahab, and they came close to him. Your father screamed out, get! Pulled me under him. He bent over me. The whips cracked on his back. The father didn't cry. He groaned, he winced, but he didn't cry. I was unhurt, untouched. In the cattle car, I wanted to thank him. Your father answered me, how could you thank me? Is there any Yid who wouldn't have done the same for another Yid? I then said to him, can I know your name? And your father said, the name's not important. Just remember, one Yid did what he had to do. I insisted. Finally, your father said, all right, I'll tell you my name on one condition. That you'll never tell the story. I promise. He told me his name was Fulda. In Buchenwald, we were separated. Didn't see him again in the concentration camp. Evidently, by some miracles, we both survived. My father's case, I sure know that there were a whole bunch of miracles, any one of which would not have been. And years later, once, on the streets of New York, I meet him. story as long as he was alive. But now that he's not here any longer, now I think the mitzvah is to tell the story. And he added to me, Rabbi Fulda, now that you know the story, the mitzvah is for you to tell the story. No, Rabbi Rabbosai, I have told you the story. And now the mitzvah is
there are some narrations which are cheapened by saying thank you, and I think that was one. I'd like to ask Rabbi Mandelbaum to please benching, and then we go into the